When you taste the cold steel of a gun barrel or the betrayal of an enemy, you can still smile because at least you know who they are. But when the one putting you in the ground is the very flesh and blood you used to cradle in your arms, that coldness seeps right into your bones. I'm Arthur, and this is the story of how my only son sold my life for $2 million. I've lived in this small Ohio town nearly my whole life. For 40 long years, I worked as a welder at the steel mill on the outskirts of town. 40 years of breathing in that thick air, heavy with the smell of metal and machine oil, earning a network of tiny burn scars permanently etched into my forearms. But I never regretted a single day of it. People on TV talk a lot about the American dream like it's some grandiose thing. For a blue-collar guy like me, that dream was simple. A wooden house with a wide front porch, a neatly mowed lawn, and no mortgage hanging over my head in my twilight years. My late wife, Martha, and I actually did it. We paid off the mortgage on this house 10 years ago. When Martha passed away from cancer 2 years ago, she went peacefully, knowing I'd be safe in our home, backed by a $1.2 million 401n that we had scraped together penny by penny. But our greatest asset, our crowning achievement, wasn't the money. It was Julian, our only son. Unlike his grease-stained old man, Julian was the picture of success. We drained our life savings when we were young to put him through an Ivy League college. Now at 35, Julian is a senior investment broker on Wall Street. He lives in New York, wears Tom Ford suits that cost more than my monthly pension, and drives sleek sports cars. Every Thanksgiving, when he brought his beautiful wife, a marketing executive, home to visit, the neighbors would look at me with sheer admiration. I thought my life was complete. I had done my job as a father. That is, until a late autumn Tuesday afternoon. Julian never visited in the middle of the week, and he certainly never showed up unannounced. Yet, that afternoon, his black Porsche Panamera tore through the quiet of our neighborhood and parked right in front of my lawn. He stepped out, flashing that same confident smile, wearing that same perfectly tailored suit. But having been his father for 35 years, I immediately sensed something was off. He had dark circles under his eyes, despite clearly trying to hide them. As he walked up the steps, I noticed his thumb constantly scraping against his index finger. A nervous tic he'd had since elementary school whenever he broke a neighbor's window and hadn't confessed yet. And the strangest part, when I casually glanced through the tinted windows of the Porsche as I went out to greet him, I caught a glimpse of a crumpled stack of papers on the passenger seat, bearing the red logo of a collection agency. But almost instantly, Julian hit the lock button on his key fob with a sharp beep, his eyes averting mine. I had some business out this way in Ohio. Thought I'd drop by and see my old man, he said, pulling me into a tight hug. He smelled heavily of expensive cologne, but underneath it, I could smell the cold sweat. I poured us 2 glasses of bourbon. We sat on the wooden bench out on the porch. Instead of asking about my bad back like he usually did, Julian kept checking his phone. Then he cleared his throat and looked me dead in the eye, dead serious. Dad, he lowered his voice. I'm really worried about you. Do you have any idea how ruthless the laws in this state are to seniors? He started painting a terrifying picture of the probate court. He told me that if I were to pass away suddenly like Mom did, the government would freeze all my assets. They'd take 40% of the house's value in estate taxes, and my 401n would be bled dry by massive legal fees before it ever reached his hands. You've worked your whole life, paid taxes your whole life. I can't stand by and watch the government rob you and Mom of your life's work. Julian's voice trembled, full of what looked like genuine concern and righteous anger on my behalf. You need a living trust, Dad, and you need it right now. Listening to my son, a wave of warmth and pride swelled in my chest. He was a financial expert. He understood the numbers, understood the laws of this country way better than this old welder ever could. And above all, he wanted to protect our family's legacy. But isn't the paperwork a nightmare? I really don't want to drive all the way up to those fancy law offices in the city. I sighed, rubbing my aching knee. The corner of Julian's mouth twitched. A micro-expression so fleeting that if you weren't staring right at him, you'd miss it completely. You don't have to go anywhere, Dad, he said quickly, reaching into his leather briefcase. I've taken care of everything. I had my firm's legal department prepare a revocable living trust and the related authorization pages, completely free of charge. All you need to do is name me successor trustee so I can step in if anything happens to you. No probate, no delay, no money lost to lawyers. He pulled out a thick stack of papers, dense with legal language and cross-references I could not have decoded if I had all day. Sign here, and this last page, Dad. I hesitated, holding the Mont Blanc pen he handed me. Shouldn't we call the local real estate lawyer in town just to look it over? Suddenly, Julian slammed his hand on the table. The sharp crack made me jump. A flash of pure rage crossed his face, but it was instantly buried under a look of sheer desperation. You don't trust me? I'm your own blood. I manage hundreds of millions of dollars for clients every single day. The market is insanely volatile right now. We need to lock down your assets this afternoon to keep them safe. Besides, he checked his Rolex. My friend, a licensed notary public, has been sitting at the coffee shop down the street waiting for us. I have a flight back to New York at 7 p.m. Dad, let me protect you. The pleading in my son's eyes, the ticking clock, and the blind trust of a father, it all mixed into a perfect poison. I put on my reading glasses, and I signed. 6 signatures in total. Just 5 minutes later, the mobile notary walked into the house and stamped his red seals on the contract. Everything happened as fast as a tornado. When Julian hugged me goodbye to leave, he squeezed tight. But as he turned his back and walked toward the Porsche, I heard him let out a breath. It wasn't the sigh of relief from a son who had just secured his father's twilight years. It was the ragged, sickly exhale of a drowning man who had just managed to pull his head above water. The sports car roared to life and sped off into the twilight. I stood on the porch, holding the glass of bourbon. The ice completely melted. A cold wind blew through the oak trees. This wooden house had sheltered me for 40 years, but at that exact moment, a sudden chill ran down my spine. A gut feeling so terrible my stomach tied into knots. I didn't know what had just happened yet, but I had just signed the death warrant on my own freedom. For the first 2 weeks after I signed the living trust, everything seemed perfectly normal. My lawn was still green, the wooden porch swing still creaked in the wind. But then the invasion began, not with guns or violence, but with the sugar-coated concern of my daughter-in-law. Rachel was the quintessential modern New York woman. Sharp, obsessed with control, and always speaking in a tone that made you feel like you were in a boardroom presentation. One Saturday morning, a van with a security company logo parked in front of my house. 3 electricians armed with ladders, drills, and boxes of equipment marched in. Dad, Julian and I are just so worried about your safety, Rachel said over the phone, her voice dripping with sweetness but leaving absolutely no room for argument. Your neighborhood has been getting sketchy lately, and you're living all alone. What if you take a fall? We've upgraded your whole place to a smart home system. I've already paid for everything up front. In just one morning, my old schoolhouse was turned into a damn space station. They installed a Ring doorbell, infrared cameras at the front door, back door, the hallway, and even one right in the kitchen, pointed directly at the dining table. They completely replaced my deadbolts with electronic keypad locks. You're completely secure now, sir, one of the installers smirked, handing me a massive user manual. I stared up at the black lens in the corner of the ceiling. Its little blue LED light blinked incessantly. Rachel was right. This system would protect me from intruders outside. But what I didn't know then was that its real purpose wasn't to keep people out. It was to keep me locked in, allowing the real intruders to control my every move from hundreds of miles away. This house, the fortress of a free blue-collar man, had officially become a high-tech prison. 3 nights later, the system showed me what Rachel meant by safety. I had fallen asleep in my recliner with a baseball game murmuring on the television. At 11:17 p.m., the doorbell began chiming over and over. When I opened my eyes, 2 sheriff's deputies were standing on the porch, their flashlights washing the living room in white light. "Mr. Miller," the taller one asked, "we received a welfare call. Your son reported that you were confused, wandering outside, and trying to drive." I looked past them at my truck. It had not moved all day. Before I could answer, Julian's voice burst through the doorbell speaker. "Officer, thank God. He forgets things now. Please don't let him talk you into leaving." The younger deputy studied me. His name tag read Caldwell. I remembered him as a skinny boy who used to ride his bicycle past the mill. "Mr. Miller," he said carefully, "what day is it?" "Wednesday, November 9th, 11:20 at night." The Guardians lost by 3 runs, and my son is lying to you from Manhattan. The older deputy almost smiled. They checked the kitchen, the medicine cabinet, and the truck keys hanging exactly where they belonged. I answered every question. I gave them my doctor's name, my date of birth, and the last 4 digits of my social security number. Nothing about me suggested confusion, yet Rachel kept interrupting through the speaker. She said I had good days and bad days. She claimed I had left the stove on twice. She told them a memory care assessment was already scheduled. Deputy Caldwell finally leaned toward the camera. "Mom," he appears alert and oriented. "We can't remove a competent adult from his own home because a relative is worried." The blue light went dark. Rachel had disconnected. The deputies left after midnight, but Caldwell paused at the bottom step. "Mr. Miller," he said quietly, "start writing things down. Dates, calls, names. Family disputes get ugly when somebody starts building a paper trail." I watched his cruiser disappear, then returned to the kitchen. On the counter sat a padded envelope I had not noticed before. Inside was a medical alert bracelet linked to Julian's phone, and a bottle of prescription sedatives bearing my name. I had never seen the doctor listed on the label. That was when I understood the cameras were only half the trap. Julian and Rachel were not merely watching me. They were manufacturing a history, confusion, wandering, medication, police welfare checks. Official-looking record at a time. I carried the pills into my study, crushed none of them, swallowed none of them, and locked the bottle in my old tackle box. Then I opened a spiral notebook and wrote, November 9, 11:17 p.m. False welfare call. Deputies Caldwell and Mercer. Unknown prescription delivered. For the first time, I stopped thinking like a father trying to understand his son. I started thinking like a witness. The control didn't stop with the cameras. A week later, I walked out to the mailbox, a daily ritual I'd kept up for 40 years. Empty. Supermarket flyers, no fishing magazines, and most suspiciously, no monthly statement from Fidelity for my 401, no utility bills. I called the local post office. Familiar clerk hesitated before answering. "Arthur, didn't you know? An official change of address form was filed online 3 weeks ago. Julian used a durable power of attorney, included in your estate planning packet, to route all your mail to a P.O. box in Manhattan. He attached a note saying you were moving into a care facility soon." Moving into a care facility? I gripped the receiver so hard my knuckles turned white. I might forget a neighbor's birthday, but I hadn't missed a single bill payment in my entire life. But that was just the beginning of the isolation bill. My old buddy, a Marine vet who always swung by on Friday afternoons to drink beer and watch football, knocked on the door that week. Just as I was about to turn the knob, a cold, robotic voice blared from the smart doorbell. It was Julian, speaking through his phone all the way from New York, broadcasting over the speaker. "Hi, Bill. My dad isn't doing too well health-wise, and his doctor put him on strict bed rest. Please don't disturb him right now. I'll let you know when he's feeling up for visitors." I froze behind the wooden door. I reached out to unlock the deadbolt, only to realize the PIN code had been changed remotely. I banged on the glass to get Bill's attention, but his 70-year-old hearing was shot. Through the pain, I watched my best friend scratch his head, looking utterly confused, before trudging back to his pickup truck and driving away. I stood there as the shadows grew long in the living room. Blue light from the corner camera blinked again. For the first time in my life, I felt a primal fear. I was being erased from the world, and I was still breathing. Everything hit a boiling point on a Thursday morning. I decided I needed to get out of the house, breathe some fresh air, and pick up a few essentials. I drove my beat-up Ford F-150 down to the Kroger in town. I only grabbed a box of screws, 2 packs of joint pain relievers, and a bag of everyday ground coffee. The total came to barely $35. I walked up to the checkout lane, smiling at Sarah, a cashier I'd known for years. I swiped my Bank of America debit card. The machine let out a harsh beep, and bold red letters flashed on the screen. "Declined." I frowned. "Must be a glitch in the machine, sweetheart. Try running it again," I said. I always kept at least $15,000 in cash in my checking account for emergencies. How could it decline? Sarah ran it again. Same message. She looked up at me, her eyes shifting from confused to deeply pitying. The 3 or 4 people in line behind me started shifting their weight and sighing impatiently. "Arthur, the system says the account is frozen, or there's insufficient funds," Sarah whispered. trying to spare me the embarrassment. But in a small town, no secret is small enough. My face burned like I'd just been slapped. 40 years of busting my ass. I had never owed a single cent to anyone. Never let my wife or kid go hungry for a single meal. And now, at 68 years old, I had to stand there, being stared at like some broke drunk who couldn't afford a cheap bag of coffee. I dug through all my pockets, managed to scrape together a crumpled $20 bill to pay for just the painkillers, left the rest on the belt, and walked out to my truck with my head down. Sitting in the freezing cab of my truck, my hands shook as I dialed Julian's number. It took 3 tries before he finally picked up. "Dad, I'm in a meeting." "Is this an emergency?" he whispered, sounding irritated. "Why was my debit card declined?" "That's my money in there," I roared, humiliation finally giving way to fury. There was a beat of silence on the other end. When Julian spoke again, he had shifted into the smooth, placating tone of a customer service rep. "Oh God, I'm so sorry, Dad. It's just the transfer process for the living trust. The bank has to freeze the old accounts to verify identity and set up the new ones under the trust's name. Federal regulations, Dad? It's super strict. It'll just take a few weeks to clear up. Are you hurting for cash? Check the bottom drawer of my old desk. I left a crisp $100 bill in there for you. Just use that for now. I really have to get back to this meeting." Click the dial tone hummed in my ear, cutting like a knife. Federal regulations? I might not know the ins and outs of a trust fund, but I wasn't an idiot. A bank doesn't freeze your everyday debit card for a probate procedure unless there's a court order, or unless someone had intentionally drained it dry. I stared at the piece of plastic in my hand. A bitter taste rose in the back of my throat. A horrifying truth was beginning to take shape in my mind. But a father's heart is a stubborn thing, fighting it tooth and nail. I started the engine and floored it back home. This time, I didn't look at the blinking blue lights of the cameras. I walked straight into my study, the one room in the house they hadn't put an eye in. I opened the bottom drawer, reaching past the $100 bill, and pulled out my rusty old lock-picking kit from my younger days. It was time to go get my stolen mail. It was time to find out exactly what my perfect son was doing. With 40 years of my blood, sweat, and tears, the study was the only room in the house Rachel hadn't deemed high risk enough for a camera. Probably because there was nothing in here but my old oak desk, some dusty fishing trophies, and a heavy-duty sentry safe that Julian had brought over during his renovation of my life. "I put all your original deeds, birth certificates, and social security cards in here, Dad," he had told me with a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Fireproof and waterproof. I'm keeping the only key in New York, just in case someone breaks in." I sat on the worn leather chair staring at the gray steel box. My hands, calloused and thick, were shaking as I unrolled the canvas pouch of lockpicks. I hadn't touched these since I was a reckless teenager breaking into junkyards. But muscle memory is a funny thing. I slipped the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyhole, applying light pressure, and slid the rake pick in. Click, click, clack. The cylinder turned. The heavy latch disengaged with a dull thud. I pulled the heavy door open. Inside wasn't just my birth certificate. It was a graveyard of my life's work, neatly organized in manila folders. Julian hadn't bribed some kid to steal my mail. He had weaponized the legal system against me. Using the power of attorney, he had executed an official USPS mail forwarding request online. Every bank statement, every bill, every notice of what he was doing was legally and quietly rerouted to a locked box in New York before it ever reached my zip code, while he brought the crucial documents back here during his business trips. I grabbed the thickest folder, labeled Fidelity Investments. I opened it, and the breath was knocked out of my lungs. The statement was dated 3 days ago. My 401th, the $1.2 million that Martha and I had sacrificed vacations, new cars, and fancy dinners to build, was gone. I traced my trembling finger down the columns of numbers. There had been a massive, ungodly liquidation. After mandatory tax withholding, transaction costs, and transfers through several accounts, over $700 had been wired out to an account I didn't recognize. The remaining balance was a pathetic $4,312. No, 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 I muttered, flipping frantically through the papers. Then I found the second folder. It had the logo of a national bank I had never done business with. I pulled out a stapled contract. Across the top, in bold, undeniable letters, it read, "Home Equity Conversion Mortgage." I read the terms, legal jargon swimming before my eyes. A reverse mortgage. But how? The law requires an independent appraisal and mandatory phone counseling. I flipped to the back of the packet and felt sick to my stomach. There was an appraisal report with photos of my house, dated on a Friday afternoon, the exact time Julian knew I always drove to the VA post to play cards with Bill. He had sent an appraiser to snoop around my property while I was gone, and right behind it was a forged HUD counseling certificate. He either faked my signature or had some older client of his impersonate me on the mandatory phone call. Behind the counseling certificate, I found a thinner folder marked medical. Inside were copies of emails to a private geriatric consultant in New York. Rachel had described me as paranoid, aggressive, and unable to manage money. She had attached short video clips from the house, carefully edited moments of me searching for my glasses, limping after working in the yard, and arguing with Julian over the phone. Ordinary pieces of an old man's life had been cut together to resemble decline. There was also a draft letter on a physician's letterhead stating that I likely lacked capacity for complex financial decisions. The signature line was blank, but a yellow note beside it read, "Need before Friday intake." The unknown sedatives suddenly made sense. If I arrived at Shady Pines groggy and disoriented, every lie in that file would appear true. At the bottom of the folder lay photocopies of 6 signature pages from the packet Julian had brought me. The first 2 belonged to the Living Trust. The next 4 did not. They were a durable financial power of attorney, a medical authorization, permission to obtain my records, and a nomination of Julian as preferred guardian. He had hidden 4 different weapons inside one stack of paper and rushed me through all of them with the Thasium silver pen. I photographed every page with the old digital camera I used for fishing trips. Then I returned the documents in the exact order I had found them. Julian believed he had stolen my identity. What he had really done was leave me an inventory of the crimes. Julian had used the authority he buried in the signature packet to take out a $400,000 lump sum reverse mortgage against my paid-off house. I still held title, but the home was now burdened by a debt large enough to swallow nearly all its equity. If I died, sold the property, or permanently moved out, the loan would become due. He hadn't protected my assets from the government. He had gutted me like a fish. Why? That was the word screaming in my head. Why would a millionaire Wall Street broker, a man who wore $5,000 suits, need to steal $1 million from his blue-collar father? I dug deeper into the safe, pulling out a crumpled, coffee-stained envelope that Julian must have accidentally tossed in there. It wasn't addressed to the trust. It was addressed to Julian, forwarded from his pristine Manhattan penthouse. It was a letter from the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, dated 6 months ago. Notice of permanent bar. Read the paragraphs, my heart turning to lead. Julian wasn't a senior broker anymore. He had been fired, terminated for unauthorized trading and misappropriation of client funds. The letter detailed how my golden boy had been secretly gambling with his clients' portfolios on high-risk offshore crypto exchanges, trying to cover massive personal losses, but it didn't end there. Beneath the FINRA letter was a final notice from a debt collection agency, the same red logo I had seen on the passenger seat of his Porsche. It wasn't a standard bank collection. It was from a shadow lending firm. He owed them $850,000 in margin calls. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Julian wasn't a success. He was a fraud, drowning in debt, likely with dangerous people breathing down his neck. The Porsche, the Tom Ford suits, beautiful wife. It was all a crumbling facade. And to keep that facade from collapsing, to keep himself out of prison or a wooden box, he had thrown his own father under the bus. My life savings didn't go into a secure trust. It went straight into the pockets of Julian's creditors. I sat on the floor of the study, surrounded by the paper trail of my destruction. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, that it bypassed anger and went straight to a cold, numbing void. I looked at a picture of Martha and me holding a newborn Julian on the desk. We worked until our bones ached, Martha. And for what? To breed our own parasite. As I began putting the papers back to hide my tracks, a glossy, trifold brochure slipped out from the back of the safe. I picked it up. It was an advertisement for Shady Pines Assisted Living, a state-run, Medicaid-funded facility about 3 hours away. It was notoriously known in our county as the place where families dumped their elderly to die. Stapled to the brochure was a printed email correspondence between Rachel and the facility's director. Rachel, Oct 12. Yes, Arthur's dementia is progressing rapidly. He poses a danger to himself. We have full medical and financial power of attorney. We need a secure memory care unit. We are prepared to sign the intake forms next Friday when we visit him. Danger to myself? Next Friday. That was tomorrow. I stared at the date. The trap wasn't just to steal my money. It was to erase me entirely. Once they placed me in that facility using the authority I had foolishly signed, they planned to use the admission, the sedatives, and the fabricated medical record to petition a court for guardianship. If they succeeded, I could lose the legal power to contest the trust or report the fraud, while Julian and Rachel waited for me to die and collected the remaining insurance. I didn't cry. Tears are for the weak, and right now, weakness meant death. I slowly stood up, my joints popping in the quiet room. I carefully placed every document back into the sentry safe exactly as I had found it. I locked it, wiped my fingerprints off the dial, and rolled up my lockpicks. I walked out of the study and stepped into the living room. The blue LED light of the corner camera blinked at me. I didn't glare at it. I didn't smash it with a hammer, even though every fiber of my being wanted to. Instead, I shuffled my feet, hunched my shoulders, and faked a slight limp as I walked toward the kitchen. I played the part of the frail, forgetful old man perfectly. Let them watch from their high-rise in New York. Let them think the lamb was ready for the slaughter. But I was no lamb. I was a steelworker. I had spent 40 years bending iron to my will in furnaces that burned at 3,000 degrees. I picked up the kitchen phone, stepping just outside the camera's audio range, and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Hello," a gruff voice answered. "Bill," I whispered, gripping the receiver tightly. "It's Arthur. I need a favor. Don't come to the front door. Meet me at the back fence in 10 minutes. And Bill, bring your brother's business card. The one who works as a federal prosecutor." Julian thought he was the smartest guy in the room because he knew Wall Street. But he forgot one crucial detail. He was fighting an old man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The war hadn't even begun. Bill came through the back lot 10 minutes later, moving between the bare oak trees instead of using the sidewalk. He wore a camouflage jacket and carried a red metal toolbox, as though he had come to repair a fence. With him was his younger brother, Daniel Mercer, an assistant United States attorney home from Cleveland for the week. Daniel had Bill's square jaw, but none of his rough edges. He listened without interrupting while I told them about the trust, the empty accounts, the reverse mortgage, the false medical records, and the Shady Pines intake scheduled for the next day. When I finished, Daniel did not promise an arrest. He did not tell me some movie story nonsense about federal agents breaking down doors before sunrise. He said, "First, we keep you alive. Second, we preserve evidence. Third, we get you an elder law attorney. Everything else depends on jurisdiction and proof." That plain answer made me trust him. We met in the narrow strip behind my tool shed, where the kitchen camera could not see. Daniel photographed the notebook from the welfare check and the bottle of sedatives. I gave him the memory card from my fishing camera, containing images of the documents in the safe. "Do not confront them alone," he warned. "They're coming tomorrow," I said. "If I run, they'll say I'm confused. If I refuse to open the door, they'll bring facility staff or police. I need them to talk." Bill cursed under his breath. Daniel looked toward the house. "Do the cameras record audio locally?" I remembered the installer complaining about our weak internet. He had shown Rachel a slot in the smart hub and said it could store 48 hours of backup footage. "Yes. Then don't disable anything," Daniel said. "Let their own system hear them." The plan was simple enough to remember under pressure. I would keep the original documents untouched. Bill would wait at the diner 2 blocks away with his phone on. Daniel would alert the county prosecutor's elder abuse unit and ask Deputy Caldwell to note that I had appeared competent during the welfare visit. A lawyer named Sarah Jenkins would prepare an emergency filing, but would not submit it until we had clear evidence that Julian intended to use the documents against me. Daniel also handed me a cheap prepaid flip phone. "Keep it off. Put Bill on speed dial. Your smart system won't know it exists." I slipped it into the inner pocket of my old leather work jacket. Before they left, Bill grabbed my shoulder. "Artie, come stay with me tonight." For one aching second, I wanted to. I wanted to walk away from the house, the cameras, and the son who had become a stranger. But the safe held the originals, and tomorrow's meeting could expose the entire scheme. If I disappear before they arrive, they'll change the story, I said. They'll say a confused old man wandered off. I need them comfortable. I need them arrogant. Bill's face tightened. And what happens if they get violent? I look through the kitchen window at the blinking blue light. Then the world finally sees who they are. That night I prepared the house like a man preparing a welding job. I checked every connection twice. I moved the smart hub behind a stack of cookbooks so no one could casually remove its memory card. I placed copies of the financial records in a manila folder and left the originals locked away. I set the prepaid phone in my jacket pocket and hung the jacket near the front door. Then I did one more thing. I called the mobile notary whose stamp appeared on the documents. At first, he pretended not to remember me. When I read the commission number from his seal, his voice changed. "Mr. Miller, I only witnessed signatures. You arrived 5 minutes after Julian handed me the papers." Silence. I told him about the hidden powers of attorney and the forged counseling certificate. I told him law enforcement was already reviewing the matter. That last part was not entirely true yet, but Daniel had taught me that criminals often filled silence with useful information. The notary began to breathe too fast. "Julian said you had reviewed everything," he whispered. "He said you were hard of hearing and might appear confused. He paid me $5,000. I never saw you sign the last 4 pages. They were already signed when I arrived." My grip tightened around the receiver. "Will you say that again to an investigator?" He hung up, but he had said enough. The call log proved contact, and fear had opened the first crack in Julian's wall. I slept very little. Around 4 in the morning, I sat at the dining table beneath the camera and looked at the framed photograph of Martha holding Julian as a baby. "I'm sorry," I told her. "Tomorrow I stop protecting him." At dawn I made coffee, shaved, and put on the faded flannel shirt Martha always said made me look 10 years younger. By 2 o'clock I was ready. The following Friday afternoon, the crisp autumn air outside couldn't cut through the heavy, suffocating silence inside my house. Precisely at 2 p.m., the familiar deep rumble of the Porsche Panamera's engine rolled up the driveway. The smart doorbell chimed. I didn't need to check the monitor. Through the living room window, I watched Julian step out of the driver's side, wearing another immaculate Tom Ford suit, though today he looked a bit more haggard. Right behind him stepped Rachel, holding a thick leather folder packed with forms from Shady Pines Assisted Living. They didn't knock. Julian had the master digital code. The front door clicked open, and they walked in as if they already owned the place, because legally, according to the crooked paperwork, they did. "Dad?" Julian called out, tossing his car keys onto the kitchen counter with a practiced, casual clatter. "We're home. We've got some exciting news to talk about." I sat quietly at the dining table, a half-empty cup of black coffee resting in front of me. I didn't stand up to greet them. I just stared straight ahead, keeping my posture slightly slouched, playing the part of the fragile old man they expected to see. Rachel stepped into the dining room, her face locked into that patronizing, sickeningly sweet smile corporate lawyers use right before they crush you. "Arthur, you're still sitting in the dark? We told you need to get out more. But don't worry, we've taken care of everything for your future." Julian walked in behind her, unbuttoning his suit jacket and pulling out a chair across from me. He sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, fixing me with a gaze that wasn't warm or filial. It was the look of a wolf evaluating an easy meal. "Look, Dad, let's not beat around the bush," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of warmth. "We know you've been struggling. Your memory is slipping, the bills are piling up, and living alone in this big house is dangerous. We found a fantastic place for you. Top-notch medical care, a secure memory care unit, professionals 24/7. He pushed the thick leather folder across the table toward me. At the top of the stack, the bold letters stared me right in the face. "Voluntary admission and temporary guardianship agreement. Shady Pines. Just sign the intake forms here," Julian continued, tapping a manicured finger against the dotted line. "Rachel and I have already signed as your legal guardians. Once you're checked in, we can list the house on the market, clear out the back taxes, and finally put all this stress behind us." I slowly lifted my head. I looked at the man sitting across from me, the boy I had spent 40 years sweating for, the son I had paid an Ivy League tuition for, the flesh and blood I had loved more than my own life. I didn't cower. I didn't tremble. I picked up my coffee cup, took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter liquid, and set it back down. Then, I reached into the pocket of my flannel shirt, pulled out a thick manila folder, and dropped it right on top of their nursing home papers with a sharp thud. Julian blinked, his confident smile faltering for a split second. "What's this?" "Open it, Julian," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the raw, grating weight of a steelworker who had spent decades shouting over blast furnaces. "Read page 4, the part about the Fidelity Investments liquidation." Rachel's smile vanished instantly. She shot a sharp, nervous glance at her husband. Julian's hand reached out slowly, flipped open the folder, and pulled out the bank statements. As his eyes scanned the printed columns, showing the vanished 401n, the ungodly early withdrawal penalties, and the wire transfers to his shadow debt collectors, all the color drained completely from his face. His carefully styled hair suddenly looked ridiculous against the sheen of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Dad, this is just tax restructuring," Julian stammered, his voice cracking, the polished Wall Street veneer shattering into a million pieces. "The trust. We had to move the funds to protect it from who, Julian?" "From me," I interrupted, leaning forward. The weak, slouched old man vanished, replaced by the veteran welder who had stared down danger 1,000 times. "Or protect it from the bookies and margin calls. Did you really think an old man wouldn't know how to pick a lock in his own study?" The room went dead silent. The blue LED light on the corner camera blinked mockingly. Julian slammed his hands down on the table and jumped to his feet, his mask of filial piety completely torn away, revealing the desperate, cornered rat underneath. "Fine. You found out," Julian shrieked, spittle flying from his lips, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Do you have any idea how much debt I was in? If I didn't liquidate your account, those guys would have broken my legs and put a bullet in my head. I'm your only son. I had everything on the line, and you're sitting here hoarding $1 million you were just going to take to the grave anyway." "And the house?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Did the bookies need the house too?" "The house is gone," Rachel screamed, stepping in, her sweet corporate persona replaced by pure venom. "The reverse mortgage is signed and recorded. You don't own a damn thing, old man. You're broke, you're senile, and without us, you're nothing. You signed the trust. Legally, you gave it all to us." Hearing those words come out of the mouths of the two people I loved most in this world wasn't a shock anymore. It was an execution. A sudden, crushing weight slammed against my chest, as if a 2-ton steel beam had dropped directly onto my ribs. A white-hot pain radiated down my left arm, searing through every nerve. The air in my lungs turned to ash. I grabbed the edge of the dining table so hard my fingernails dug into the old oak. A heart attack. My vision began to blur at the edges. The room started spinning. I gasped for air, but my chest refused to expand. Arthur?" Rachel muttered, stepping back, her anger suddenly turning into panic as she saw my face turn ashen gray. I slumped forward, sliding off the chair and hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The pain in my chest was excruciating, tearing my heart apart from the inside out. I lay there on my side, clutching my chest, wheezing for every breath. I turned my head and looked up at them. I expected Julian to drop to his knees. I expected him to scream for help, to grab his phone and dial 911. He was my son. Deep down, beneath all the betrayal and greed, a dying father's soul still begged for that last shred of human decency. Instead, Julian froze. He stared down at me lying on the floor, gasping for life like a fish out of water. Then, slowly, methodically, he looked away from me and locked eyes with Rachel. There were no tears, no panic, only a chilling, unspoken calculation passing between husband and wife. Rachel's eyes widened slightly, and she whispered something so cold it froze my blood. "If the ambulance comes, if he survives this, the whole fraud comes to light. The house, the trust, everything falls apart. But if his heart just gives out before help arrives?" Julian didn't answer with words. He slowly stepped over my convulsing body, walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up his car keys, and stuffed them into his pocket. Then he stood over me, looking down with a look of pure, unadulterated annoyance, as if I were a broken appliance that had decided to short-circuit at the worst possible time. "You're always making things difficult for me, aren't you, Dad?" Julian said softly, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. He didn't dial 911. He walked over to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside with Rachel. The smart doorbell chimed, a cheerful little greeting as the door clicked shut behind them, locking me inside to die on the floor. As I lay there on the cold hardwood, my vision fading into absolute blackness, the physical pain in my chest was nothing compared to the howling void in my soul. This is it, I thought. They win, the parasites win. My breath hitched. My eyelids grew heavy. The sounds of the world began to fade into a distant, muffled hum. A sudden flash of memory cut through the darkness. Not of Julian, but of the steel mill. 40 years standing in front of 3,000-degree furnaces, the sweat burning my eyes, the skin peeling off my arms, the brutal, unforgiving grind of survival. I hadn't survived 4 decades in a hellhole of molten iron just to choke to death on the cold floor of a house stolen by my own blood. I am Arthur. I am a welder, with a final superhuman surge of pure, unadulterated spite. I dragged my paralyzed left hand across the floor. My fingers brushed against my heavy leather work jacket, hanging from the coat rack by the door. In the pocket was my old flip phone, dumb, battered, but working. Using my last ounce of consciousness, I hooked my finger into the pocket, pulled the phone out, flipped it open with my teeth, and smashed the emergency speed dial button I had programmed for Bill decades ago. The line connected just as the darkness swallowed me whole. "Bill," I wheezed. "They left me. Send help and call Daniel." Then the world went completely black. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was not the ceiling of my house, nor the pearly gates of whatever heaven might accept a broken old man. It was the harsh, sterile white of a hospital ceiling tile, punctuated by the rhythmic, mechanical beep of a heart monitor. Beep, beep. I wasn't dead. My stubborn, calloused heart had refused to stop ticking. I turned my head slowly on the stiff hospital pillow. Sitting in the corner chair was Bill, reading a battered paperback Western novel. His old eyes caught movement, and he was out of the chair in a heartbeat, rushing to my bedside. "Easy, Artie. Take it slow, you son of a gun," Bill muttered, his voice thick with emotion as he poured a small cup of ice water and held a straw to my lips. I drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing my raw throat. The phone?" I rasped. "Got your call. Paramedics reached your place just 2 minutes before your wonderful son and his trophy wife pulled back into the driveway." Bill snarled, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched. "The cops found you unconscious on the floor. And guess what? Your brilliant Wall Street boy told the responding officers that you were just having a senile spell and dramatically acting out, and tried to wave them off. But my brother, the federal prosecutor, had already put a flag on your file after our chat the night before. The police didn't leave. They hauled him into an interrogation room right there on the porch." I didn't cry. I didn't scream or curse the heavens. A profound, terrifying calm washed over me. All the grief, all the paternal love I had carried for 35 years, burned away in the white-hot furnace of betrayal. There was nothing left inside me of the father who had sacrificed his youth for a parasite. There was only Arthur the welder. And a welder knows that when a piece of metal is hopelessly rotten, you don't try to fix it. You cut it out, root and branch, and throw it in the scrap heap. A week later, after the cardiologist finally discharged me with strict instructions and a bag full of medication, Bill drove me straight to a downtown law office overlooking the gray waters of Lake Erie. Waiting for us inside the sleek glass-walled conference room was Sarah Jenkins, a partner at Jenkins and Miller Elder Law, a ruthless litigation firm specializing in white-collar financial fraud and elder abuse. She didn't look like a traditional country lawyer. She wore a sharp navy pantsuit, carried an iPad, and had eyes like a hawk that had spotted a field mouse from a mile up. "Mr. Miller," Sarah said, standing up to shake my hand with a grip surprisingly firm for a woman half my age. "Your friend Bill has filled me in on the broad strokes. What your son and daughter-in-law tried to pull appears to involve elder financial exploitation, fraud, forgery, and a deliberate failure to summon aid during a medical emergency. But to unwind the documents and support criminal charges, we need evidence that survives every challenge." I slid a small, plastic micro-SD card across the polished mahogany table. "What's this?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "My house," I replied quietly. "Julian and Rachel set up everything on their fancy cloud accounts so they could watch me from New York. But Rachel is a control freak. She insisted the installers use a smart hub with a local micro-SD backup slot, just in case my cheap rural Wi-Fi dropped and they missed something. They thought they were building a high-tech prison. They didn't realize they were burning their own confessions onto a piece of plastic the size of a fingernail. Sarah plugged the SD card into an adapter on her iPad. Her fingers danced across the screen. For the next 10 minutes, the conference room filled with the recorded audio of that fateful Friday afternoon. The sound of Julian's frantic, venomous admissions echoed off the glass walls. How he confessed to liquidating my 401n, how he laughed about the stolen house, and most damning of all, the crystal-clear recording of Rachel whispering, "If the ambulance comes, the whole fraud comes to light. But if his heart just gives out," followed by Julian stepping over my dying body to walk out the door. When the audio file ended, absolute silence filled the room. Sarah stared at her iPad screen, her face pale. Even Bill was trembling with barely contained rage, his fists clenched into rocks. Sarah looked up at me, a cold, sharp smile playing on her lips. "Well, Mr. Miller, congratulations. Your son was smart enough to get a degree from an Ivy League school, but he was arrogant enough to leave a digital footprint straight to a felony conviction. With these recordings, plus the hospital logs and the financial wire receipts, we aren't just going to break that living trust. We are going to bury them." Sarah did not smile for long. Before she could file the emergency motion, Julian struck first, at 8:12 the next morning. A process server arrived at Bill's house with a petition for emergency guardianship. Julian claimed I was suffering from rapidly progressing dementia, had become violent, and was being manipulated by unrelated third parties who wanted my estate. Attached were the edited camera clips, the draft medical opinion, now bearing a physician's electronic signature, and the sheriff's welfare call number, stripped of the deputy's conclusion. The petition asked a probate judge to place me under Julian's temporary control immediately and order the return of all stolen financial documents and electronic devices. "He knows about the memory card," Bill said. "Or he suspects it exists," Sarah replied. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for that afternoon. Sarah could have asked for a delay, but she chose the opposite. "Let him put his lies under oath," she said. The probate courtroom was small, wood-paneled, and crowded with people waiting for routine estate matters. Julian appeared by video from New York, beside an expensive attorney. Rachel sat next to him, dressed in black, her expressions carefully arranged into grief. Their lawyer spoke first. He described me as a vulnerable widower, surrounded by opportunists. He showed the court a clip of me forgetting where I had set my glasses, and another of me stumbling near the porch. Then Rachel testified. She said I had stopped recognizing neighbors. She said I had threatened her. She said the sedatives were prescribed after a telehealth consultation for my own safety. Sarah stood. "Mrs. Miller, did Arthur participate in that telehealth consultation?" Rachel hesitated. "He was present in the home. That was not my question. I facilitated it under his medical authorization." "Did the doctor see or speak to him?" Rachel's eyes flicked toward Julian's image on the screen. "No." A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. Sarah called Deputy Caldwell. He testified that during the welfare check I knew the date, location, recent baseball score, medication list, and names of both responding officers. His report stated there was no evidence of impairment or danger. Then Sarah called the physician whose signature appeared on the capacity letter. The doctor looked furious. He testified that Rachel had sent him records for a preliminary family consultation. But he had never examined me and had never authorized a final opinion. The electronic signature had been copied from an unrelated invoice. Julian's attorney requested a recess. The judge refused. Sarah's final witness was the mobile notary. He entered through a side door with his own lawyer and the gray face of a man who had not slept. Under oath, he admitted. Julian paid him $5,000, that several pages had been signed before he arrived, and that he had falsely certified witnessing them, because Julian promised the transaction was harmless estate planning. On the video screen, Julian lost control. "He's lying," he shouted. "They're all lying because my father is paying them." The judge stared at him. "Mr. Miller, mute yourself or I will hold you in contempt." Sarah placed the micro SD card into evidence. She played only 90 seconds. Julian confessing that he liquidated the account. Rachel stating that no ambulance should be called if I collapsed, and the front door closing while I remained on the floor. No one in the courtroom moved. The judge denied the guardianship petition. suspended every power granted to Julian and Rachel, ordered preservation of all financial and cloud records, and referred the testimony to state and federal investigators. He also appointed an independent fiduciary to protect the remaining assets until the fraud case could be heard. Outside the courtroom, Julian called my phone 11 times. On the 12th call, I answered. "Dad," he said, his voice low and trembling, "you don't understand what you're doing. These charges will destroy my life." I looked through the courthouse window at Bill and Sarah, speaking with investigators. "You destroyed your life when you stepped over me." I was scared. So was I. "We can fix this as a family." "No," I said. "A family calls an ambulance." I ended the call and handed the phone to Sarah. The father in me had spent 35 years making excuses for him. The witness in me would make no more. Counter-offensive began on a Tuesday morning, executed with the precision of a military strike. Sarah filed an emergency civil motion in county court, presenting the recordings, bank records, and sworn testimony. By the end of the day, first legal orders were in place. The court suspended Julian's authority under the trust and powers of attorney, pending a full hearing, barred any sale or transfer of my home, and restored my immediate control over ordinary living expenses. An emergency asset preservation order froze the accounts that had received my money and required the banks to trace every transfer. State and federal investigators opened coordinated cases. Within 48 hours, after reviewing the recordings and financial records, prosecutors obtained warrants for Julian and Rachel on charges including theft, financial exploitation of an elderly person, identity fraud, forgery, and failure to summon aid. At the time the warrants were executed, Julian was sitting in a glass conference room at a private crypto advisory company that had hired him under a vague consulting title, despite his FINRA bar. Corporate security entered with 2 federal agents and placed him in handcuffs in front of the partners he had been trying to impress. Rachel was arrested at their suburban Connecticut home while packing designer bags, her face captured in high definition by local news cameras, as she shrieked and covered her head with a Senile scarf, without my $1.2 million 401n, acting as a hidden collateral cushion for his high-risk offshore crypto accounts, and with his personal bank accounts frozen by court order. Julian's entire house of cards collapsed overnight. The shadow lenders he owed $850,000 to didn't care about his Wall Street pedigree. They sent repo men to clean out his Manhattan penthouse and repossess his prized Porsche Panamera while it was parked outside the precinct. His fancy friends, his high-status clients, and his elite social circles vanished like smoke in the wind. The bank holding the reverse mortgage on my Ohio home tried to enforce the loan, but Sarah Jenkins tore their contract to shreds in court, proving the loan was procured through fraudulent representation and identity theft by the designated trustee. The bank was forced to drop the foreclosure and turn its legal wrath directly onto Julian's personal estate to recover their losses. My son, the golden boy who thought he was smarter than everyone else, ended up in county custody, broke and abandoned by the circle that had celebrated him. Rachel began blaming him for everything, hoping cooperation would reduce her own sentence. The criminal case lasted 8 months. Rachel accepted a plea agreement and testified that Julian had designed the scheme after his trading losses became impossible to hide. She admitted choosing Shady Pines because its intake staff rarely challenged relatives who arrived with powers of attorney. She also admitted ordering the sedatives and editing the camera clips. The notary lost his commission, pleaded guilty to falsifying acknowledgments, and agreed to cooperate. The physician's forged signature added another count. Bank records traced my retirement money through 3 shell accounts before most of it reached offshore lenders. Julian never apologized. At trial, he insisted he had borrowed the money to save his own life and intended to repay it after one successful market cycle. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict him of financial exploitation, theft, identity fraud, forgery, and failing to summon aid during a medical emergency. At sentencing, the judge allowed me to speak. Julian stood in a dark suit that no longer fit him properly. For a moment, I saw the 8-year-old boy who used to wait at the mill gate with Martha, waving both arms when my shift ended. That memory almost broke me. Then I remembered the locked door, the false dementia file, and his footsteps crossing the floor while I could not breathe. I do not hate my son, I told the court. Hate would mean he still owns space inside me. I am here because what he did should not be hidden behind the word family. Blood is not permission. Love is not a signature. And age does not erase a person's right to choose his own life. Julian received a 12-year sentence. Rachel received 4 years under her cooperation agreement. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from the county jail. Julian wrote that he forgave me. I read that sentence twice and then fed the letter into the fireplace. Some metal can be repaired. Some has to be cut away. A month after the storm had passed, I stood on the front porch of my old house for the very last time. The air was crisp and smelled of autumn leaves, just like the day Julian had pulled up in his Porsche to sign away my freedom. The house was filled with too many ghosts. Echoes of Martha, memories of raising a boy who turned out to be a monster, and the heavy weight of a life lived for someone who didn't deserve it. I didn't want the house anymore. I called a local real estate agent, sold it as is in less than a week, and transferred the proceeds into a secure, untouchable annuity that would pay for my medical needs without any human interference. I didn't buy another house. Instead, I drove down to a dealership in the next county and paid cash for a brand new, top-of-the-line Class C recreational vehicle. A rolling home painted the color of gunmetal gray. On a bright Saturday morning, Bill and a few old buddies from the mill gathered on the street to wave goodbye. "You sure about this, Artie?" Bill asked, leaning against the door of the RV, a bittersweet smile on his weathered face. At your age, driving cross-country alone, I climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted the rearview mirror and smiled. A genuine deep smile that I hadn't felt in years. My back didn't hurt as much. My chest felt clear and light. "Bill," I said, putting the heavy machine into drive. For 40 years, I was chained to a workbench. For 2 years, I was locked in a smart home prison by my own son. For the first time in my entire life, nobody owns me. Nobody knows where I am, and nobody can tell me what to do. I pressed the gas pedal. The engine roared to life with a deep, satisfying hum. I pulled away from the curb, leaving the memories, the betrayal, and the ghosts behind. Ahead of me stretched Route 66, cutting through endless fields of golden corn, disappearing into the vast, open horizon of America. The road was wide, the wind was warm, and for an old welder who had stared down the fire, the rest of his life belonged entirely to him.